A few years ago, I moved into a small, one-story house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just on the edge of the suburbs, giving me what felt like the best of both worlds. The houses weren't packed too close together, so there was plenty of privacy, but it was still close enough to town to make grocery runs and errands easy. The area didn't have streetlights, so at night it was pitch black unless the moon was out. I didn't mind the darkness. In fact, I liked it. It gave the house a quiet, peaceful feeling, like my own little bubble away from the world. I'm a nurse, so I'm used to working odd hours and holidays. That year was no different. I worked Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and as it turned out, I was also scheduled for New Year's Eve. I didn't mind too much, though. I didn't have much family to celebrate with, so staying busy at work was better than being alone. On New Year's Eve, I ended up staying overtime to help out. By the time I got home, it was about 7 in the evening, and I was completely drained. The night was dark and cloudy. Without any streetlights, the only light came from my car's headlights and the dim glow of my porch light. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd, a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. It struck me as strange since I didn't smoke, and I'd never smelled it around my house before. I sat in my car for a moment, scanning the quiet street. Everything seemed normal. The neighboring houses were dark, and there wasn't a soul in sight. Shrugging it off, I told myself it was probably someone walking by earlier and went inside. All I wanted to do was take a quick shower and collapse into bed. My shift had completely worn me out. After cleaning up, I didn't even bother turning on the TV or checking my phone. I just climbed into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime later, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, but it was definitely coming from inside the house. At first, I wasn't alarmed. My friend sometimes stopped by after work to use my shower on his way to his night classes. I'd even given him a spare key. The thing is, he always texted me first to let me know, and I didn't remember hearing my phone go off. Groggy and still half asleep, I reached for my phone on the bedside table. The bright screen lit up the dark room, momentarily blinding me. Squinting, I saw it was 9:30, and sure enough, there was a text from my friend. Relieved, I set my phone down and called out his name. Silence. I called out again, a little louder this time. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, hurried footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart dropped. Those weren't the familiar, casual steps of my friend. They were frantic, purposeful, and loud enough to send a jolt of fear through me. Without thinking, I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. I pulled the door open and slipped inside, just as I heard the intruder start up the stairs. My hands were shaking as I looked up and remembered the attic access panel in the ceiling of the closet. It was my only chance. As quietly as I could, I pushed the panel up and began hoisting myself into the attic. My muscles strained as I pulled myself up, trying not to make any noise. Just as I got my feet off the closet floor, I heard them reach the top of the stairs. The house had 3 rooms upstairs: my bedroom, the guest room across the hall, and a small bathroom at the end of the hallway. My bedroom door was closed, but the bathroom door was slightly open. I stayed as still as I could, listening intently. The footsteps paused outside my door before it was shoved open with a loud bang. I froze, pressing myself against the attic floor as tightly as I could. The intruder moved around my bedroom, their heavy steps echoing in the quiet house. I heard drawers being pulled open and things being tossed onto the floor. After a few minutes, the footsteps left my room and headed toward the guest room. The door slammed open, and I could hear them rifling through the boxes and odds and ends I had stored in there. I knew they wouldn't find much. That room was mostly empty except for some old weights, a table, and a few paintings I'd been working on. Moments later, the footsteps came storming back into my room. This time, the light flicked on, illuminating the space below me. My heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. Then, I heard the closet door creak open. And from my vantage point in the attic, I could see their legs through the opening. They were wearing dirty jeans with frayed cuffs and scuffed work boots. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look up. For what felt like an eternity, the intruder stood there, scanning the closet. Then, without warning, they let out a guttural scream of frustration. It was a raw, angry sound that sent chills down my spine. The scream reminded me of my stepfather's outbursts when he'd lose his temper, wild and uncontrollable. The intruder stomped out of the closet and back down the hallway, their heavy footsteps echoing through the house. I stayed crouched in the attic, listening as they tore through the downstairs rooms. I could hear furniture being flipped, glass breaking, and drawers being yanked open. The chaos seemed to go on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. The stillness was almost worse than the noise. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of movement, but there was nothing. I didn't dare move. I started counting in my head, trying to keep myself calm and gauge how much time had passed. I made it to 1,000 before I finally worked up the courage to climb down. My legs were trembling as I lowered myself into the closet, and I nearly stumbled when I stepped onto the floor. The first thing I noticed was that my bed had been flipped over. That must have been the loud crash I heard earlier. My room was a mess. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and the drawers from my nightstand had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor. My phone was nowhere to be found. I crept over to the landline by my bed and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The operator stayed on the line with me until the police arrived. When I heard the officers calling out from downstairs, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I hurried down to meet them, but the sight of my living room stopped me in my tracks. The place was a disaster. The couch was flipped, chairs were overturned, and the contents of my shelves were scattered across the floor. In the kitchen, the cupboards were open, and canned goods and boxes of food were spilled everywhere. Despite all the damage, the only thing missing was a single knife from the wooden block on the counter. The police searched the house from top to bottom and found how the intruder had gotten in. The side door had been pried open, likely with a crowbar. Outside, near the fence line, they found cigarette butts, a piece of foil, and an empty pen tube, items often used for drugs. It was clear the person had been watching my house for some time, waiting for the right moment to break in. The thought made my skin crawl, that smell of cigarette smoke I noticed when I got home. It hadn't been from earlier in the day. They'd been there, just outside, watching me as I pulled into the driveway. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. The police advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. But I didn't have any nearby friends or family. Instead, I spent the night cleaning up and barricading the broken door with a heavy bookshelf. Every so often, I'd shine a flashlight out the windows, scanning the fence line where the cigarette butts had been found. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next day, I had the door repaired and installed motion-activated lights around the house. I also ran a phone line up to the attic, vowing never to be stuck up there without a way to call for help again. Though I lived in that house for another 3 years, nothing like that ever happened again. Still, the memory stayed with me. Every night when I climbed into bed, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to being found that night. The image of those dirty jeans and scuffed boots standing in the closet doorway is something I'll never forget. This story happened on New Year's Eve of 2016. I was living in Iowa at the time, and anyone from around here knows how bitterly cold the winters can get at night. The snow outside had turned everything quiet and still. When it snows like that, the world seems almost frozen in time, and every little noise stands out. That night, my best friend Colton and I were hanging out in my family's walkout basement. We didn't have much planned, just a boring New Year's Eve spent playing video games. My mom had gone out to a bar right after work to have a few drinks with her coworkers, so we were completely alone in the house. At some point during the night, Colton and I decided it might be fun to sneak into the family's wine cabinet and grab a bottle to celebrate the new year. We didn't think much of it. It just seemed like a harmless way to pass the time. As we sat there opening up the first bottle, laughing quietly about how we'd need to put everything back exactly as it was so my mom wouldn't notice, I suddenly heard the sound of the garage door opening and then slamming shut. I froze. For a second, I thought maybe my mom had come home early, and my first instinct was to hide the bottle. My heart was racing as I looked around for a good spot to stash it. That's when I heard heavy footsteps, deliberate and loud, moving from the garage toward the stairs. Then I heard my mom's voice call my name. "Hey, can you come help me with something?" she said, her voice echoing down the stairs. At first, I felt a wave of relief. It had to be her, right? But something about the situation still felt off. I yelled back, "I'll be there in a minute," and listened for her reply, but there was nothing. Just silence. A minute passed and I heard her call out again. This time her voice sounded different. It was her voice. I was sure of that. But it didn't feel right. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite explain. It was almost like her tone was missing some kind of warmth, like it was flat or hollow. Then she asked me a question that made my stomach drop. "Is anyone down there with you?" That question hit me hard because it didn't make sense. My family never cared if I had friends over. Our house was always open to anyone, and my mom had never once been bothered by Colton being around. The way she asked it, though, felt wrong, like she was suspicious or something else entirely. I turned to Colton, who was already looking uneasy, and whispered, "Something's not right." Still, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe she was just tired from work or something. So, I yelled back up, "It's just me and Colton." As soon as I said that, though, I regretted it. The second the words left my mouth, a heavy silence fell over the house. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. After a few moments of stillness, I decided I needed to go upstairs and see what was going on. I told Colton to stay put and started climbing the stairs. As I reached the top, I realized the house was completely dark. Not a single light was on. That wasn't like my mom at all. She always turned on the kitchen light or the living room lamp when she got home. I called out, "Mom," but there was no reply. The only light came from the dim glow of the snow outside, barely illuminating the kitchen windows. I stepped into the kitchen, my footsteps sounding way too loud in the silence. I called her name again, louder this time, but still, nothing. My uneasiness was growing. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. To my surprise, she picked up immediately. "Hey, where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm still at the bar," she said. "What's wrong?" Her answer made my blood run cold. If she was still at the bar, then who the hell was in the house? I quickly explained what had happened, and her voice turned serious. "Listen to me," she said. "Go back downstairs. Lock the basement door. Stay there? I'll be home in 5 minutes." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted back down the stairs, grabbing my coat along the way. When I got to the basement, I locked the door and told Colton everything. He looked as scared as I felt, but we didn't have much time to think. A few minutes later, we started hearing noises upstairs. It wasn't footsteps exactly, but we could hear movement. The kind of movement that lets you know someone's there, even if you can't see or hear them clearly. It felt like the house wasn't empty anymore. Colton and I sat there in silence, barely daring to breathe. Every now and then, we'd hear a faint creak or a rustle, like something shifting around above us. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to let us know we weren't alone. My mom had said she'd be home in 5 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Finally, after what felt like forever, we heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Almost instantly, the feeling in the house changed. Whatever had been upstairs, whatever had been making those noises, it was gone, just like that. The second her car arrived, the oppressive, heavy presence vanished. When my mom came inside, I ran up to meet her, talking so fast I could barely get the words out. She took one look at me and Colton and knew we weren't making it up. We all went upstairs together, and even though everything seemed normal at first, we could all feel that something wasn't right. The house felt off, like it was holding its breath. We checked every room, every corner, but we didn't find anything. No open windows, no unlocked doors, nothing out of place. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished without a trace. My mom tried to reassure us, but I could tell she was shaken too. She told us it was probably nothing, maybe just our imaginations running wild, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe it any more than we did. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It had sounded so much like my mom, but at the same time, it hadn't. It was like something was trying to mimic her but didn't quite know how to do it perfectly. And then there was the feeling in the house, that overwhelming sense of being watched, of not being alone. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. I never found out what happened that night. My mom passed away a few years later, and I've since moved to Arizona, but every New Year's Eve, I think about that night. I think about the voice that called my name and asked me to come upstairs. Whatever it wasn't human. I don't know how I know that, but I do. And every time I remember that night, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had gone upstairs a little sooner or if my mom hadn't answered the phone. Some questions, I guess, are better left unanswered. Hey everyone, I'm curious to know more about you all. Drop a comment below and let me know which country you're watching from. I love seeing how far our community reaches, so don't be shy. I'll be reading through the comments. On New Year's Eve of 2016, my family and I gathered at my Aunt Sarah and Uncle John's house to celebrate the end of the year and the arrival of the new one. This event had become a tradition, something we all looked forward to every year. It was the highlight of our holiday season. My aunt and uncle were wonderful people. They always made me feel welcome, loved, and cared for. They were always there for me, whether I needed advice or help with something. Uncle John, especially, had a special place in my heart. He was like a second father to me. Whenever my parents needed help or guidance, my aunt and uncle were the first ones they turned to, and they always stepped in without hesitation. Uncle John wasn't just a great person. He was also an outdoorsman through and through. He was the type of man who loved camping, fishing, and everything related to nature. If there was a chance to go out into the wilderness, Uncle John would take it. He would often bring me along on his adventures, teaching me about the woods and how to survive in the wild. I admired him for it. He made nature feel like a place of wonder rather than fear, something I'll always be grateful for. The small piece of land behind their house was mostly covered by trees and brush, and Uncle John used this area for his fishing and camping trips. It was a quiet, secluded area that I never thought much about. It was until that night. It was around 7 p.m. when we finally arrived at their house. My mom had made her famous casserole, which was always a hit at family gatherings. There were about 60 people in total at the party. Family, friends, and a few people I didn't recognize. I was only 12 at the time, so I wasn't too interested in the conversations or the music. Most of the adults gathered around the living room to drink, laugh, and talk about the year that had passed while waiting for the ball drop at midnight. It was the kind of event where everyone was either chatting or playing board games, enjoying the evening with those they loved. As usual, I was the only kid at the party. I wasn't bothered by it, though. I had always been more of an introvert, preferring to keep to myself rather than getting involved in the chaos of adult conversations. I was content to sit in the rocking chair on the back porch and watch the fireworks display in the distance. The night was crisp, and the air had that cold bite that only comes with winter. It wasn't unbearable, but it made me pull my jacket tighter around me as I settled into the chair. The first firework lit up the sky, its bright light illuminating the area around me. The burst of color made everything feel momentarily alive, and for a second, I felt the excitement that everyone else seemed to have. But as the fireworks continued, something else caught my attention. Something that I couldn't ignore. As another firework lit up the sky, I saw him. A man. Standing just beyond the tree line of my aunt and uncle's wooded area, partially hidden by the thick trees. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. He was tall, and even in the dim light, I could make out his form standing still and watching me. At first I thought I might have imagined him, but then, in the next burst of light from a firework, I saw his face. Pale and still, as if he had been standing there for a while, waiting for something. I couldn't look away. Something about the way he was staring at me made my skin crawl. His eyes were dark, and he wasn't moving at all. For a moment, I thought about calling out to someone, but I didn't. I felt frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, the man slowly raised his hand, and with a subtle motion, he beckoned me over to him. It wasn't an aggressive motion, but there was something about the way he waved that made my stomach churn. I wasn't sure if I should go over, or if I should ignore him and call for help. But at that moment, I didn't move. I stayed where I was, too afraid to approach, yet too curious to leave. The man didn't say anything at first, but there was something about the way he looked at me that seemed off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything in my body told me to be cautious. Then, after a few moments of silence, he spoke. "Hey there," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I'm a friend of your uncle's. I've got a late Christmas present for you." For a brief second, I thought that maybe he was telling the truth. After all, Uncle John knew a lot of people, and if he was a friend of his, maybe he was just being friendly. But even then, something didn't sit right with me. Why was he hiding behind the trees? Why didn't he just come out into the light to say hello? I wasn't sure what to do. A strange mix of curiosity and fear swirled inside me. I looked down at my feet, unsure of whether I should walk away or approach him. The man continued to stand there, motioning for me to come closer. He seemed harmless enough, but the feeling in my gut told me that this wasn't right. Still, I couldn't shake the curiosity. What did he want? What kind of gift was he talking about? Before I could make a decision, I heard a familiar voice cut through the night. It was my dad, shouting from behind me. "Hey, who are you?" The moment my dad's voice rang out, the man stiffened, as if he hadn't expected to be noticed. His body tensed for a second before he turned and sprinted toward the woods. He disappeared into the dark trees so quickly that I barely had time to react. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but I felt a surge of relief that my dad had been nearby. He quickly ran toward me, his face showing signs of both anger and concern. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, grabbing my arm gently and pulling me toward the house. "Who was that man? What did he want?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "He said he was a friend of Uncle John's, and that he had a present for me. But I didn't go closer. He just wanted me to come over to him." My dad didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Without wasting any time, he marched me into the house, where my mom, aunt, and uncle were still talking and enjoying the party. He explained everything that had just happened, and immediately, my aunt and uncle became serious. "That man is not a friend of ours," Uncle John said, his voice sharp. "We don't know him. We don't know what he was doing out there. He shouldn't have been anywhere near our property." Aunt Sarah immediately grabbed the phone and called the police. They needed to know everything I could remember about the man's appearance. His height, his maroon hoodie, and the fact that he had been hiding behind the trees. The officers arrived quickly, and we all waited in a tense silence as they began their search. The police combed the woods with flashlights, calling out into the dark, looking for any sign of the man. They walked through the trees, their footsteps crunching in the snow. My heart raced as I watched them, my thoughts swirling with questions. Who was this man? Why had he been watching me? Was he planning something worse than just scaring me? After a while, the police returned. They hadn't found anything. No sign of the man. He had vanished, leaving only the lingering sense of unease behind. The officers said they would keep an eye out in the area, but they couldn't find any trace of him. The thought that someone had been watching us from the woods and was now gone, leaving no evidence, sent chills down my spine. That night, the party continued, but it wasn't the same. Everyone was on edge. People kept glancing over their shoulders, and no one seemed to relax. The fun of ringing in the new year had been overshadowed by the strange man in the woods. What was his plan? What would have happened if I had gone closer? What was he after? There were so many unanswered questions. As the night wore on and the countdown to midnight began, I found myself thinking about what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had almost happened. If my dad hadn't shown up when he did, if I had walked a little closer to the man, things could have turned out very differently. The fear of what might have been stayed with me long after the fireworks had ended and the ball had dropped. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I wonder who the man was and why he had been there. What had he wanted from me? What would have happened if I hadn't listened to that gut feeling that told me not to go over? I don't know if I'll ever get those answers, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never look at the woods behind my aunt and uncle's house the same way again. Last year marked my 4-year anniversary with my boyfriend. We hadn't really done anything big to celebrate in the past, so this time we wanted to plan something special. At the time, we were living in Massachusetts, and after tossing around a few ideas, we decided a romantic weekend getaway was exactly what we needed. Vermont seemed like the perfect choice. It's well known for its wintry charm, and we hoped to find a cabin tucked away in the woods, blanketed in snow. After searching through Airbnb, we found what seemed like the ideal spot. It was a cozy cabin with a hot tub, surrounded by trees, and owned by a man named Jerry. He was new to Airbnb, but his listing already had 3 5-star reviews. That seemed good enough for us, so we booked it without hesitation. My boyfriend's heavy-duty truck was perfect for snowy roads, so we decided to drive. As we got closer to the cabin, about 10 minutes out, I noticed my phone lost service completely. We tried my boyfriend's phone, and thankfully it still had a signal, so we used it to finish the route. When we were about 5 minutes away, the GPS led us onto a remote private road. The road was narrow and lined with tall, snow-covered trees, making it feel isolated. It ended in a small roundabout, and from there, the driveway to the cabin began. The driveway was long, steep, and covered in fresh snow. At the top of the hill, the cabin came into view, and I couldn't help but admire how beautiful it looked. Thick white smoke was curling out of the chimney, and the snow covering the roof made it look like something out of a postcard. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and we had to climb a set of icy stairs at the back to get to the front door. I was already imagining the warm fire and the peaceful weekend we had ahead of us. When we got inside, there was a booklet left on the kitchen counter with information about the cabin. It included a note explaining that a plow service was contracted to clear the driveway whenever it snowed, so we shouldn't be alarmed if we saw tire tracks or heard someone plowing. That made sense, and it helped ease any concerns about being in such a remote area. We unpacked our bags and settled in. The cabin was cozy, and while we quickly realized that my boyfriend's phone also had no service, the booklet mentioned a landline in the kitchen in case we needed it. That first night was everything we hoped for. We lit a fire, played board games, and watched Christmas movies while the snow fell outside. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly the getaway we needed. We planned to spend the next day exploring the nearby town and then have dinner at a restaurant where I'd made a reservation. The following day went smoothly. We spent most of the day in town, walking through small shops and enjoying the local charm. We returned briefly to the cabin in the afternoon to get ready for dinner before heading back out. The restaurant was amazing, and by the time we finished eating, we were excited to get back to the cabin, relax in the hot tub, and enjoy the rest of the night. As we drove back, we noticed the temperature had dropped, and a fresh layer of snow had blanketed everything. It was picturesque. As we turned onto the private road leading to the cabin, my boyfriend suddenly slowed the truck and stopped. The headlights were shining up the driveway, and he turned to me and asked, "Do you see those tire tracks?" I hadn't noticed them at first, but as I looked closer, I realized there were fresh tracks leading up the driveway. It was strange because the driveway hadn't been plowed, and we hadn't seen anyone all day. Maybe the plow service came by, I suggested, though it didn't make much sense since the snow clearly hadn't been touched. Still, we tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. My boyfriend turned the truck around and drove us back into town. He sent a message to Jerry through Airbnb, asking if he or someone else had stopped by the cabin. We waited for a while in a parking lot, but no reply came. We could have called Jerry on the landline, but it was already late, past 10 p.m., and my boyfriend assured me I was probably overthinking it. After a while, we headed back to the cabin. When we arrived, we drove all the way up the driveway and parked in the garage. As I stepped out of the truck, my stomach dropped. There, in the fresh snow, were footprints. They started from the middle of the driveway and led towards the cabin. I froze and called my boyfriend over. He followed the tracks with his eyes, and we both felt the creeping unease. Someone had clearly driven up the driveway, parked, gotten out of their car, and walked onto the property. But where had they gone? The cabin was surrounded by thick trees, and with all the snow, it was impossible to tell where the footprints ended. We both agreed it was better to be safe than sorry. We drove back down the road until we had cell service and called the local police. An officer arrived shortly after, and we led him back to the cabin. He walked the property, shining his flashlight into the trees and checking every corner of the cabin. After a thorough search, he told us he didn't find anything. The officer reassured us it was probably nothing and left. We were embarrassed but still on edge. The idea of relaxing in the hot tub now seemed out of the question. Instead, we locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat in the living room watching TV until we finally felt calm enough to laugh at our paranoia. Exhaustion eventually took over, and we fell asleep on the couch. Around 3 a.m., we both woke up at the same time. The TV was still on, and all the lights were on, too. I didn't know what had woken us up, but we figured it was probably just a log popping in the fireplace, or some other harmless noise. We decided to head to the bedroom to get some proper sleep. My boyfriend went to brush his teeth while I tidied up the living room. That's when I heard it. A low, mechanical humming sound. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was unmistakable. My boyfriend came running out of the bathroom, his face pale. Was that the garage? I whispered. He nodded, his expression grim. There was no reason anyone should be opening the garage at that hour, especially when the cabin was clearly occupied. We had left all the lights on, so anyone outside could easily tell we were inside. We sat frozen in silence, straining to hear any other sounds. Then, we heard it. The door from the garage to the cabin unlocked with a loud click. My boyfriend grabbed his pistol from his suitcase and quickly loaded it. We could hear slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the cabin. Despite my fear, I followed closely behind my boyfriend as he crept down the hallway towards the living room. When we rounded the corner, we saw him. A man with his back turned to us was standing in the middle of the room, holding something in his hand. My boyfriend raised the pistol and ordered the man to turn around. The man jumped in surprise and slowly turned to face us, raising his hands in the air. My stomach dropped when I saw his face. It was Jerry, the cabin owner. His face was bright red, and he stammered, "I didn't know you were here already." In his hand was a cheap camera. My boyfriend demanded to know what he was doing there, and Jerry stumbled over his words, claiming he'd mixed up the dates and thought the cabin was empty. But his explanation didn't make sense. Why would he come into the cabin in the middle of the night? And why did he have a camera? I ran to the landline and called the police while my boyfriend kept the gun trained on Jerry. The officers arrived quickly and took him into custody. We explained everything, but in the end, Jerry wasn't arrested. He somehow convinced the police that it was all a misunderstanding, claiming he'd marked the wrong date on his calendar. Disgusted and shaken, we packed our bags and left that night, checking into a hotel. We reported the incident to Airbnb, who banned Jerry from their platform and gave us a full refund. But the whole experience left us uneasy. What had Jerry really planned to do? And why did he have that camera? We'll probably never know, but one thing is certain. We'll never stay at another remote cabin again. For the rest of the night, we barely spoke. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence, and the glow of the morning sunlight was a relief when it finally arrived. Vermont's snowy beauty had lost its charm, leaving us with memories we'd rather forget. It was a trip meant for celebration, but instead, it became a story of unease and questions that will never truly be answered.